Okay, today we are picking up with Egypt, and Egypt is located on the Nile River, and all society in Egypt is going to be pretty much based on the Nile River and the Delta region of the Nile. So the Nile River is the basis for their creation myth of how the Egyptians came into being. It's based around Alam, which is the god of creation. But basically, here's what happens. On the Nile River, every September through November, it floods. So every year, this river floods. And it deposits silt. And silt is mineral-rich soil, which is going to be very good for farming. Remember, this is a time when people are starting to settle down and you want to grow crops. Well, farming's going to be a big part of that. And so having good soil is going to be an especially good part of that, especially when it's close to water. So the Egyptians will eventually build reservoirs and irrigation ditches, which are going to help them to control the flooding. But the silt itself makes for very fertile land, and so the Egyptians are going to have a ton of agricultural supplies, and that's going to help influence their culture and how much it grows and how rich it becomes eventually. So Egypt is split into two regions. It's Upper Egypt, which was located in the south, and Lower Egypt, which was located in the north, which probably sounds weird, but the north was the Delta region. The Nile River runs from the south to the north, and so the lower part of the river, where the river dumps into the Mediterranean, is where Lower Egypt would be, and that's in the northern region of the Nile. So the Delta region had a lot of marshland that was made of silt, making it very, very fertile. So they really are going to utilize that. Communication and political unity are all brought about because of the Nile River. The Nile River will be important for trade and communication between different sites in Egypt, as well as having water supply and travel. And it's going to help unify the Egyptians together as a culture. They also, in Egypt, had a lot of natural resources like stone and clay and gold. And on top of that, they had their agriculture. And so they were able to grow wheat and flax. And flax is a fibrous plant which is used to help make clothing. So it's it's as important to the Egyptians as like cotton is to India. And so, like I said, the Nile River has a lot of basis in how they develop. The pharaoh, or the king, pharaoh in Egyptian means great house, and so the pharaoh is considered to be like the house of a living god, and so the god's spirit lives within the human body of the pharaoh, so that's kind of why they're called a great house. But basically the pharaoh had absolute rule. They controlled the wealth, they controlled the resources, they controlled the people of Egypt, and the god that is inhabiting the pharaoh is Horus, and Horus was a falcon god. So oftentimes when you see the pharaoh depicted, there's going to be some sort of a falcon head. The Horus's father was Osiris, the king of the gods. So that's why there's that connection. But basically in Egypt we have three main periods. You had the old period, or the old kingdom, the middle kingdom, and the new kingdom. So we're going to start off with the old kingdom. And basically what we see happening in Egypt is that power is going to be passed from family to family, but it's still a united culture or a united dynasty. That's still kept intact, so it's not like major civil wars taking place. There's still civil wars, but it's just not it's not a complete takeover. It's still, anyway, well, you'll know the difference when we get to China and we start saying complete a mess. So anyway, the old kingdom of Egypt is basically the pyramid age, when all the pyramids were built. Pharaoh Menes is the founder. It's when he unifies Egypt in 3100 BCE. But the pharaohs come to power and they have divine right, meaning they have power from gods. And they did employ viziers, and viziers were ministers who helped to supervise the government, things like tax collection and the farming practices and that kind of stuff. Now, the religion of the Egyptians develops during this time, and it's very similar to the cycle of the river, that every year this happens. Well, that's kind of what their religion is like too. It's very cyclical. It's got a very rhythmic, similar to the nature that they're dealing with. So you had Osiris, who is the god of fertility. He's the king of the dead, and he dies every year. His brother, Set, is the guy who kills Osiris every year, chops him up into little bits, and throws the bits about the earth. Isis, who is the wife of Osiris, is the one who every year goes around and collects the little bits of her husband that's been spread about. And then she takes all these pieces to Aturus. And Aturus is a friend of the gods. He's the god of mummification. And together he and Isis are going to bring Osiris back from the dead. And they do this every year. And so we see in this religion that the Egyptians believed in eternal life, that there was life after death, that you could come back, kind of thing. Another major god is Amun-Re, and he is a sun god, and he has some importance later on. He's pretty closely linked with the powers of the pharaoh. But anyway, so we have this belief in the afterlife, that there's life after death, and judgment and the afterlife. Osiris, as the king of the underworld, king of the dead, he judges you when you come down and you're dead, and he judges you by weighing your heart against the feather of truth. And if you have a worthy heart, you would achieve immortality. You would live forever. And sinners, their hearts would and their bodies would be tossed to the eater of the dead, who's like this crocodile-like god. Obviously, they're taking that from nature too, seeing crocodiles in the Nile River. The pharaoh was not a mediator between the gods and the people, so it wasn't like he's talking to the gods for the people and intervening for them or anything like that. Instead, the gods are seen as caring by the Egyptians, but you don't necessarily have to get the pharaoh involved. The pharaoh is already a living embodiment. That's a way they show that they care, because they chose a human to house one of them. So it's kind of an interesting relationship going on. Now, the palace and the tombs of the pharaoh, the pyramids were built during this time, like the pyramids at Giza, were built during this time, but it took a lot of money, and it took a lot of planning, and a lot of time, and a lot of organization. And when a pharaoh died, he was buried with everything that he would need in the afterlife. So he would be buried with food, and he would be buried with clothing, and money, and jewels, and even servants. You could take them with you too. So you do have this belief in immortality, and mummification is part of that belief. They believe that you could come back and visit your earthly body, and visit your body and say, hey, how's it going, and that kind of stuff. And so in order to not scare off your spirit, they mummified you. Now, at first, mummification was just for the rich and the nobles, but later on, pretty much everybody does it. But only the rich and powerful were placed in tombs and pyramids and all that kind of stuff. But again, the idea was that if you come visit your body, you don't want to get scared off by, bones and stuff. So they're going to wrap you up and bathe you in oil and make your skin as supple as possible to make you look as lifelike as possible. Then they wrap you in these cloths so that when you do start to decompose, your spirit isn't going to see it and be off-put by it, because they felt that spirits were good. You wanted your spirit to come back to visit your body, so that they were a good thing to have around. Now, not everybody got buried in a pyramid. Some were actually buried in what's called the Valley of the Kings, and this was a burial place for pharaohs. But since the Egyptians were in power, or at the height of their power, these tombs have often been subjected to raids, so there's not very much authentic left in these tombs. And so when explorers discovered King Tutankhamun, or King Tut, and his tomb, his burial place, it was a big deal, because for the most part everybody else's had been ransacked, and so they found King Tut's intact with everything in there yet. Nothing had been touched since the day it was sealed when this king died, and he was 18 18 years old when he died. He was a fairly minor king, didn't really have a whole lot of time to do anything important. But he's most famous not for what he did, but because we found his stuff. And it was all there, and we could see what it was exactly like when the Egyptians put this king away. And this was a minor king, and if you think about all the stuff that he had, here's somebody who wasn't really that important, didn't live very long, but look at what all he had available in his tomb. So think about, if it was a more important pharaoh, what would he have had? Now, the commoners of the Egyptian Old Kingdom had a lot of taxes. They were subjected to a lot of brutality. Their freedom was basically, it was based on their talent. If you were really talented at something, you're going to have more freedom because the rich people are going to want to have you around. Like if you were a good artist or you were a good singer or dancer or something, entertainer of some sort. But there were some constraints on that freedom as well, because oftentimes the nobility or the upper classes of the Egyptians would have forced labor to build roads, pyramids, tombs, all kinds of stuff. Or you'd be forced to go into the army. And like I said, pyramids and canals and army time are all going to take a lot of manpower. But after harvest time, again, agriculture is very important. So after harvest time, the commoners were drafted to work on like the canals and the pyramids and all that kind of stuff. But they were not drafted during critical agricultural times like planting or harvesting. Those were considered kind of sacred times that you just didn't interfere with. That's how important agriculture is going to be to the Egyptians. So in our next video, we're going to look at the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom and how those developed.